What started as a secret meeting at a roadside diner turned into a nightmare when Victoria's controlling CEO husband found her there. But when he grabbed her wrist and threatened her in front of everyone, he had no idea the quiet cook watching from the kitchen was her missing brother, a decorated army sergeant who'd been presumed dead for 2 years. What happened next would destroy an $80 million empire and expose secrets that powerful people kill to protect. But Victoria's biggest shock, learning that her escape was exactly what her husband had been planning for all along. Hit that like button if you're ready for a story that proves family isn't about blood, it's about who's willing to fight for you. And don't forget to subscribe, because trust me, you won't want to miss how this ends. Victoria Hayes pressed her back against the cracked vinyl booth at Murphy's roadside diner, her 7-month pregnant belly making every position uncomfortable. The clock above the coffee machine read 3:15 on a Tuesday afternoon. She had been waiting 20 minutes, working up courage she had been gathering for weeks. This was supposed to be her moment of quiet rebellion, a secret meeting with divorce attorney Miranda Stone about escape options, while her CEO husband attended his board meeting across town. But Victoria had forgotten about the tracking app on her phone up 3 miles away. Bradley Pierce sat in his black Tesla Model S, watching her location on his tablet. At 35, he commanded Pierce Technologies, a company worth $80 million. His carefully cultivated image was that of a successful tech innovator. But right now his face showed something darker. He could see her exact position in the diner through the GPS coordinates. She had been sitting there for over an hour. The tracking showed she had turned off her phone for 37 minutes between 2:15 and 2:52. That meant she was hiding something. Bradley started the engine and pulled onto Route 9, heading toward the diner. His jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth. Victoria thought she was being clever, but he had ways of monitoring everything. Their home network, her devices, even her credit card statements showed every purchase down to the penny. Back at the diner, Victoria nervously stirred her untouched coffee. The businessman in the corner booth typed on his laptop while nursing cold coffee. 2 elderly women near the window shared apple pie and decades of friendship. A young mother tried to convince her toddler that grilled cheese was more interesting than toy cars. Normal people living normal lives, Victoria thought. When had her life stopped being normal? The diner door chimed, and Victoria's blood turned to ice. Bradley Pierce strode through the entrance like he owned the place, his expensive suit contrasting sharply with the blue-collar atmosphere. His eyes locked onto hers with predatory precision. "You will get in that car right now, Victoria." Bradley's voice cut through the diner like a blade as he slid into the booth across from her. "Or I swear to God, there will be consequences." Victoria's hand instinctively moved to protect her belly. The baby girl seemed to sense her mother's distress, kicking harder against Victoria's ribs. "I don't understand why you're upset," Victoria said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I just wanted some fresh air. The baby's been kicking all morning." "Don't lie to me." Bradley's voice dropped to that dangerous whisper she had learned to fear more than his shouting. "I can see your location. Victoria, you've been sitting in this place for over an hour. Who are you meeting?" The question hung in the air between them. Victoria could feel the weight of the other diner's attention beginning to shift toward their booth. This was exactly what Bradley hated most: public attention that he couldn't control. "No one," Victoria whispered. "I'm not meeting anyone." Bradley's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Right, just like you forgot to mention that you've been researching divorce lawyers online. Did you think I wouldn't notice the browser history? Victoria, did you think I'm stupid?" The color drained from Victoria's face. She had used private browsing. She had been so careful. But Bradley had ways of monitoring everything that she was only beginning to understand. "I don't know what you're talking about," Victoria said, but they both knew she was lying. "Get up," Bradley commanded, his voice returning to normal volume but losing none of its menace. "We're going home. Now." Victoria looked down at her untouched sandwich and cold tea. Her hands shook as she reached for her purse, a designer bag that Bradley had chosen for her birthday. Everything in her life was carefully curated by his preferences, his image of who she should be. "I'm not ready to leave," she said, the words surprising her with their firmness. Bradley's eyes narrowed. In the corporate world, people jumped when he spoke. At home, Victoria had learned to anticipate his moods. to make herself smaller so he could feel larger. But today something was different. What did you say? Bradley's voice carried that edge that made board members reconsider their positions. I said I'm not ready to leave. I'm having lunch like a normal person. You are not a normal person, Bradley snapped, his carefully maintained facade beginning to crack. You are my wife, you are carrying my child, and you will get in that car right now. I belong wherever I choose to be, Victoria said, years of suppressed frustration escaping before she could stop them. I'm a grown woman, not your property. The businessman looked up from his laptop. The elderly women stopped talking. The young mother paused in her negotiations with her toddler. The normal sounds of the diner seemed to quiet as Bradley's face flushed red. Don't you dare, he said through gritted teeth, reaching across the table to grab her wrist. His fingers wrapped around her arm with painful pressure. Don't you dare embarrass me in public like this. Victoria gasped as his grip tightened. She could feel his fingers digging into her skin, could see white marks forming where he held her. Bradley, you're hurting me. I'll do more than hurt you if you don't get up right now, he said quietly, his voice carrying controlled rage that Victoria had learned was the most dangerous kind. Get up, get in the car, and we'll discuss your little adventure when we get home. That's when the kitchen door swung open. The cook who emerged was tall and lean with close-cropped hair and alert posture that suggested military training. He wore a simple white apron over jeans and a t-shirt, but something in his bearing commanded immediate attention. His eyes swept the diner with practiced efficiency, taking in the scene at Victoria's booth with tactical assessment that missed nothing. Victoria looked up at him, and her world shifted. Cole, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Oh my God. Cole, Staff Sergeant Cole Hayes, her older brother, who she hadn't seen in 2 years thanks to Bradley's systematic isolation tactics, stood 3 feet away, wearing a cook's apron and an expression that could have frozen hell itself. Cole took one look at Bradley's hand wrapped around his pregnant sister's wrist, at the fear in Victoria's eyes, at the tears she was trying so hard not to shed. He stepped forward with quiet precision of a man trained to neutralize threats. Afternoon, folks, Cole said calmly, his voice carrying authority that came from leading soldiers through combat zones. Everything all right over here? Bradley looked up at the interruption, his face flushed with irritation at being disturbed in what he considered a private family matter. His grip on Victoria's wrist didn't loosen. Everything's fine, Bradley said dismissively. Just a small disagreement between husband and wife. Nothing that concerns the kitchen staff. Cole's eyes never left Bradley's face, but Victoria could see him cataloging every detail with military precision. The bruising grip on her wrist, the defensive way she cradled her belly, the fear in her eyes that she was trying so hard to hide. Victoria Bonetto, Cole asked quietly, his voice gentle despite the steel underneath. You okay, sis? The endearment hit Bradley like a physical blow. His carefully maintained image of control cracked as he realized this wasn't just some random diner employee who could be intimidated or dismissed. This was family. This was the brother Victoria had talked about constantly during their early dating days. You're Victoria's brother, Bradley said, his voice carrying a different quality now, calculating rather than dismissive. The military one. Staff Sergeant Cole Hayes, Cole replied evenly. And you must be Bradley. The two men studied each other across the booth. Victoria felt the tension in the air shift from domestic dispute to something far more dangerous. Bradley might have $80 million and a corporate empire, but Cole had spent 15 years learning how to neutralize threats and protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Well, Sergeant, Bradley said with forced congeniality, though his grip on Victoria's wrist remained painful. This is certainly a surprise. Victoria didn't mention you were working here. A lot of things Victoria probably hasn't mentioned, Cole replied quietly. Been a while since we had a proper conversation. Victoria caught the subtle accusation in his tone and felt a flush of shame. Bradley had masterfully isolated her from her family over the past 2 years, making her feel guilty for every phone call, every text message, every attempt at maintaining relationships outside their marriage. Yes, well, Bradley said, trying to regain control of the situation. Victoria gets very busy with her responsibilities as my wife. Corporate life is demanding, and she has the baby to think about now. Seems like she's thinking about the baby just fine, Cole observed, noting how protectively Victoria held her belly. Question is, why does she look scared of you? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Grace Murphy, the diner's owner, had emerged from behind the counter and stood watching the scene with protective alertness that came from 40 years of serving coffee and dealing with the occasional domestic dispute. She's not scared, Bradley said quickly, but his defensive tone suggested otherwise. She's just emotional. Pregnancy hormones, you understand, makes women unpredictable. Cole's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Let go of her wrist. Excuse me. You heard me. Cole's voice remained calm, but the authority underneath was unmistakable. Take your hand off my sister. Bradley's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. Being challenged by a diner cook in front of an audience was exactly the kind of public humiliation his ego couldn't tolerate. But this wasn't just any diner cook. I don't think you understand who you're talking to, Bardams, Bradley said, his voice carrying controlled rage. I'm the CEO of Pierce Technologies. I'm worth more than everyone in this diner combined. And this is my wife. Don't care if you're worth $1 billion, Cole replied evenly. Don't care if you own the whole state. What I care about is that you're hurting my sister, and I'm asking you nicely to stop. Asking nicely, well, Bradley laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think you can intimidate me? Some pathetic military washout working as a short-order cook. Cole took one step closer to the booth, close enough that his presence became impossible to ignore. At 32, he was lean and fit in the way that came from years of military discipline. While he wasn't particularly tall or imposing, there was something in his bearing that suggested crossing him would be a serious mistake. You're right, Cole said quietly. I don't know what kind of lawyers you can afford, but I know what happens when someone hurts my family. And I know that your money won't help you if you don't let go of her wrist right now. Victoria had never heard her brother use that tone before. Calm and conversational on the surface, but carrying quiet certainty that came from years of making life-and-death decisions in combat zones. Bradley must have heard it too, because his grip on her wrist finally loosened slightly. This is ridiculous, Bradley said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Victoria, tell your brother that everything's fine. Tell him we're just having a conversation. Victoria looked up at Cole, seeing him clearly for the first time in 2 years. He had lost weight since his last deployment, and there were new lines around his eyes that spoke of experiences she couldn't imagine. But his expression as he looked at her was exactly the same as when they were children, and he had positioned himself between her and neighborhood bullies. It's not fine, she said quietly, the words carrying 2 years of suppressed truth. Nothing's been fine for a long time. Bradley's face went white with shock and fury. In their private arguments, Victoria always eventually backed down, always apologized, always found ways to make his behavior her fault. But here, in front of witnesses and her brother's protective presence, she was refusing to play the role he had trained her to perform. Victoria, he said through gritted teeth, his grip tightening again until she gasped in pain. Think very carefully about what you're saying. Think about what you're risking. Cole moved so quickly that Bradley didn't have time to react. One moment he was threatening Victoria, and the next he was doubled over in the booth, his hand releasing her wrist as Cole applied pressure to a nerve point in his shoulder with his surgical precision. I asked nicely, Cole said conversationally, maintaining the pressure until Bradley's face went pale. Now I'm going to ask once more. Take your hands off my sister, apologize for hurting her, and then we can all have a civil conversation about what happens next. The diner had gone completely silent. Even the coffee machine seemed to have stopped gurgling. Grace Murphy had her phone in her hand, finger poised over 911, while the other diners watched with fascinated horror. Bradley tried to pull away from Cole's grip, but the pressure point technique was precisely applied to cause significant discomfort without leaving visible marks or causing permanent damage. It was the kind of skill that came from military training in controlling hostile situations. Let go of me, Bradley gasped, his earlier arrogance replaced by shocked pain. I'll have you arrested for assault. Will you, Bow? Cole asked mildly, not releasing the pressure. You want to explain to the police why you were bruising a pregnant woman's wrist? Want to discuss that with the local news when they pick up the story? Bradley's eyes darted around the diner, taking in all the witnesses who had clearly seen him grab Victoria, heard him threaten her, watched the entire confrontation unfold. His carefully maintained public image was cracking. "This isn't over," he said through gritted teeth as Cole finally released the pressure point. "You have no idea what you've started here." "Actually, Cole said calmly. "I think it's been going on for a while. I'm just ending it." Bradley stood up from the booth, his shoulder still aching. His face was flushed with rage and humiliation. But he was smart enough to recognize that he had lost this particular battle. The question was whether he would be smart enough to walk away or foolish enough to escalate. "Victoria," he said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that she had learned to fear more than his explosive anger. "You're making a mistake, a very big mistake, and mistakes have consequences." With that threat hanging in the air, Bradley Pierce turned and walked out of Murphy's roadside diner, leaving behind his pregnant wife, her military brother, and a room full of witnesses who had just seen the careful facade of his perfect marriage crumble in real time. Victoria looked down at her wrist, already seeing finger-shaped bruises forming on her pale skin, and realized that after 2 years of careful isolation and systematic control, she was finally not alone anymore. But as Cole helped her to her feet and Grace brought ice for her wrist, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that Bradley's parting words had been more than just angry threats. They had sounded like a promise. The silence that followed Bradley's dramatic exit lasted exactly 10 seconds before the diner erupted in concerned voices and scraping chairs. Grace Murphy was the first to move, appearing at Victoria's booth with a clean dish towel wrapped around ice. "For your wrist, honey," Grace said gently, her voice carrying maternal authority that came from 40 years of taking care of people. "Cole, get her some water and maybe some of that chamomile tea from the back." Cole slid into the booth across from his sister, his expression carefully controlled, but his eyes showing the kind of fury that came from seeing someone he loved being hurt. "How long?" he asked quietly, nodding toward Victoria's bruised wrist. "How long has this been going on?" Victoria pressed the ice-wrapped towel against her wrist, wincing at the cold but grateful for the numbing relief. The bruises were already darkening into 5 perfect finger-shaped marks. "It's not usually physical," she said quietly, not quite meeting his eyes. "Mostly it's just control. He needs to know where I am, who I'm talking to, what I'm spending money on. The tracking app on my phone, cameras in the house, monitoring my credit cards. He says it's because he loves me." Cole's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. "And the physical part?" Victoria touched her belly protectively. "Started about 3 months ago when I began showing. Nothing major. Just grabbing my arm when he was angry, pushing me away when I tried to hug him. Today was the first time he—" She gestured to her wrist, unable to finish the sentence. "Jesus, Victoria." Cole ran a hand through his close-cropped hair. "Why didn't you call me? Why didn't you reach out?" The question carried no judgment, only pain. But Victoria felt the familiar weight of shame anyway. How could she explain that Bradley had slowly, systematically convinced her that her family didn't really care about her, that Cole was too busy with his military career to be bothered with her problems? "He moved us away from everyone," Victoria said finally. "Said it was for his career, but really it was to isolate me. Then he started monitoring everything. If I called you or Mom and Dad, he'd want to know what we talked about. Why I needed to bother you with my problems." Cole's expression grew darker with each revelation, but he kept his voice calm. Combat experience had taught him that survivors needed to feel safe before they could share the full truth. "You're not bothering anyone by needing your family," he said firmly. "That's what family is for." Grace returned with chamomile tea and pulled up a chair, settling her solid frame with purposeful movement that suggested she had something important to say. "I've been watching that man for the past 20 minutes, Grace announced without preamble. "Been running this place for 38 years, and I've learned to recognize trouble when I see it. That husband of yours, he's trouble with a capital T." Victoria looked up, surprised by the older woman's blunt assessment. "You were watching us." "Honey, I was watching the parking lot," Grace corrected. "That man sat in his fancy car for nearly 20 minutes before he came in here. 20 minutes of just sitting and staring at this building like he was planning something. That's not the behavior of someone who just happened to find his wife at a diner." Cole leaned forward, his military training automatically focusing on tactical details. He was surveilling the location before moving in. That's exactly what he was doing, Grace confirmed. And another thing, I've got security cameras covering every angle of this place, including audio recording. Every word of that conversation is documented, including the threats and the part where he grabbed you. Victoria's teacup rattled against the saucer as her hands began to shake. You recorded everything. Everything, Grace said firmly. And before you start worrying about privacy, this is my establishment, and I have signs posted about security monitoring. That recording is completely legal, and it clearly shows a pattern of threatening behavior. Cole exchanged a meaningful look with Grace. In his experience, domestic abusers relied on isolation and the absence of witnesses to maintain control over their victims. Having independent documentation of Bradley's behavior would be crucial if Victoria decided to take legal action. There's something else, Grace continued, pulling her phone from her apron pocket. I started recording on this the minute I heard him raise his voice. Old habit from dealing with difficult customers. She showed them the phone's recording app, displaying a file that was nearly 15 minutes long. The timestamp showed it had started just after Bradley's voice had first cut through the diner. You recorded the whole thing, Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper, including the part where he threatened you with consequences for embarrassing him, Grace confirmed. Also got the physical assault on camera and audio. That man just handed us everything we need to get you a restraining order. Victoria stared at the phone, processing the implications. For 2 years, Bradley's abuse had happened in private, behind closed doors where there were no witnesses and no proof. It had been his word against hers, and his word carried the weight of $80 million and a flawless public reputation. But now there was evidence, independent, objective proof of his threats and violence. I don't know if I can, Victoria said quietly, one hand instinctively moving to her belly. He has so much money, so many lawyers. He could destroy me in court. And the baby, what if he tries to take the baby? Cole reached across the table and covered her free hand with his. His palm was warm and calloused from years of military service, but his touch was gentle and reassuring. Victoria, listen to me, he said seriously. I know you're scared. I know this feels overwhelming, but you don't have to face this alone anymore. I'm here. Grace is here, and we're not going anywhere. But your deployment, Victoria started, is over, Cole interrupted. I've been back stateside for 6 months, working here while I figure out what comes next. PTSD doesn't exactly make for smooth transitions back to civilian life, but helping people seems to be good therapy for me. Victoria looked at her brother with new understanding. She had been so focused on her own isolation that she hadn't considered that Cole might be dealing with his own struggles after returning from combat deployment. Why didn't you tell me you were back? She asked. Cole's expression tightened with something that might have been guilt. I tried calling a few times, but you never answered. When I finally got through, you said you were busy with Bradley's social calendar and couldn't talk. I figured you'd call when you had time. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She remembered those calls, remembered Bradley's irritation whenever her phone rang, remembered the arguments that followed if she spent too much time talking to anyone outside their immediate social circle. He made it difficult, Victoria admitted. Every call, every text, every email had to be justified. Who was I talking to? What did they want? Why couldn't I handle things myself instead of bothering other people? After a while, it was just easier to not. That's how abusers work, Grace said matter-of-factly. They isolate you gradually, make you feel guilty for maintaining normal relationships, convince you that depending on anyone else is a weakness. Before you know it, you're trapped in a world where they're your only source of information about what's normal. Victoria's phone buzzed against the table, making all three of them jump. The screen displayed Bradley's name and a text message preview that made Cole's expression turn dangerous. You'll regret embarrassing me like that. The message read, both of you, this is far from over. Victoria, you have no idea what you've started. A second message followed immediately. Come home now, and we can forget this happened. Stay away and there will be consequences you can't imagine. Cole read the messages over Victoria's shoulder, his calm facade finally cracking to reveal the fury underneath. He's threatening you. He's threatening both of us. That's what he does, Victoria said quietly. her voice carrying 2 years of exhausted defeat. He makes threats. Then when I get scared, he tells me I'm overreacting, that he didn't mean it the way it sounded. Gaslighting, Grace said grimly, making you question your own perception of reality. It's psychological abuse, honey, and it's just as damaging as the physical kind. Cole stood up from the booth with sudden decision, his military bearing returning in full force. Victoria, I need you to listen to me carefully. I'm not going back to base as planned. I'm staying here. I'm staying close. And I'm making sure you and that baby are safe. Cole, you can't. I can and I will. He interrupted with quiet authority that had commanded respect in combat zones. I let you disappear from my life once because I didn't understand what was happening. I won't make that mistake again. Victoria looked at her brother, seeing him clearly for the first time in years. The lean frame that spoke of too many combat missions and too much stress, the alert posture that never quite relaxed even in civilian settings, the protective fury in his eyes that transformed him from her big brother into the decorated military officer who had spent years learning how to neutralize threats. What are we going to do? She asked quietly. Cole's smile was grim but determined. We're going to document everything, gather evidence, and make sure Bradley Pierce learns that there are some people his money can't intimidate. Outside in the parking lot, Bradley's Mercedes sat idling under the afternoon sun, its occupant making phone calls with animated gestures that suggested he was marshaling his considerable resources for war. But inside Murphy's roadside diner, Victoria Hayes Pierce was no longer alone, no longer isolated, and no longer willing to be afraid of the man who had spent 2 years convincing her that she was powerless. The battle was about to begin, and for the first time in months, Victoria felt like she might actually have a chance of winning. That feeling lasted exactly 12 hours. At 6:47 the next morning, Victoria discovered that her debit card had been canceled and her access to their joint checking account had been frozen. She stood in the base commissary holding a cart full of basic necessities. Her card declined repeatedly while other military families waited patiently in line behind her. I'm sorry, Went, Victoria said quietly to the cashier, her face burning with embarrassment as she pulled items from her cart. I don't understand what's wrong with my card. Cole appeared at her elbow, having been alerted by his wife Emma, who was monitoring the situation from their kitchen table where she had set up a command center of legal documents and resource information. He pulled out his own wallet without comment and paid for Victoria's groceries, but his expression was grim with understanding. $67.34, Cole said quietly as they loaded groceries into his truck. That's how much it cost him to send you a message about your complete financial dependence on his goodwill. Victoria's phone had been buzzing continuously since dawn with a carefully orchestrated campaign of manipulation and intimidation. The first messages were apologetic and pleading, designed to make her feel guilty for leaving. When those didn't generate a response, they became increasingly threatening. You have no money, no job, no way to support yourself or the baby. One message read, come home and we can work this out like adults. The next message was more explicit. My lawyers tell me that abandoning the marital home while pregnant could be seen as evidence of mental instability. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. But the call that came at 9:37 that morning delivered the second devastating blow that would shatter Victoria's newfound sense of safety and hope. Miranda Stone, the divorce attorney Victoria had been meeting with at the diner, called with news that confirmed Bradley's ruthless determination to maintain control. Victoria, I need you to sit down, Miranda said, her usually confident voice tight with concern. Bradley's legal team moved faster than I've ever seen. They filed emergency petitions this morning claiming that you've been kidnapped or coerced by your military brother. Victoria sank into a chair at Cole and Emma's kitchen table, feeling the walls of her newfound freedom closing in around her. They're seeking immediate court orders to compel your return to the marital home for your own safety and that of the unborn child. Miranda continued, it's complete garbage legally, but it's strategically brilliant. Bradley's positioning himself as the concerned husband trying to protect his mentally unstable wife from dangerous outside influences. Cole took the phone, his military training automatically assessing threat levels and potential countermeasures. How dangerous is this legally? In the short term, not very, Miranda replied. We have documentation of his threats and assault. plus witness testimony. But in the long term, he's building a case that could be problematic in custody proceedings. We need to counter his narrative with evidence of our own. Emma looked up from her laptop where she had been researching domestic violence resources and legal precedents. I've been in contact with 3 other women who've had relationships with Bradley Pierce over the past 10 years. 2 of them are willing to provide testimony about his pattern of controlling behavior. Victoria's heart stopped. Other women and a college girlfriend who broke up with him after he started monitoring her phone calls and following her to classes. Emma explained. A business associate who dated him briefly and ended the relationship when he began showing up at her workplace unannounced and questioning her colleagues about her activities. The revelation that Bradley's abusive behavior predated their marriage hit Victoria like a physical blow. She had spent 2 years believing that somehow she was the problem, that her own shortcomings had triggered his controlling behavior. There's more, Emma continued. One of his former business partners is willing to testify about Bradley's reaction when she challenged him during a board meeting. He apparently became so enraged that security had to be called. Cole's expression grew thoughtful as he processed this information through the lens of his military intelligence training. He has a documented pattern of aggressive behavior when challenged or when he feels his control is threatened. That's useful, but it also makes him more dangerous. As if summoned by their conversation, Victoria's phone rang with Bradley's name on the caller ID. Cole reached for it, but Victoria shook her head and answered the call herself, putting it on speaker so the others could hear. Victoria, thank God. Bradley's voice carried perfectly calibrated relief and concern. I've been worried sick about you. Are you okay? Is the baby okay? We're fine, Bradley, Victoria said quietly, her voice steadier than she expected. I need some time to think. Think about what? Bradley's tone shifted slightly, becoming more controlling. Think about destroying our marriage. Think about keeping my child away from me. Victoria, this is insane. You're 7 months pregnant. You have no money, no way to take care of yourself. You need to come home. I don't need anything from you, Victoria said, the words carrying a strength that surprised even her. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself and my daughter. The silence that followed was loaded with Bradley's shock and rage at being contradicted. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to that dangerous whisper that Victoria had learned to fear. Your daughter, he repeated. That's my child you're carrying. Victoria, my daughter. And no court in the country will let you keep her if you continue down this path. Cole gestured for Victoria to end the call, but she shook her head. She needed to hear what Bradley was really threatening, needed to understand the full scope of what she was facing. What path is that? Bradley, she asked quietly. The path of listening to people who don't have your best interest at heart. Bradley replied, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he used in business negotiations. Your brother is a combat veteran with documented PTSD. He's violent, unstable, and he's filling your head with paranoid delusions about our marriage. Cole's hands clenched into fists, but Emma put a restraining hand on his arm. They needed to hear Bradley's full strategy before they could counter it effectively. I love you, Victoria, Bradley continued, his voice shifting back to manufactured concern. But I love our daughter more than my own life, and I won't let you put her in danger because you're confused and scared. Come home today, and we can get you the help you need. Stay away and I'll have to take steps to protect our child. The threat was clear, even couched in language of love and protection. Victoria looked around the table at Cole's furious expression and Emma's professional assessment, and felt something inside her shift and crystallize. Bradley, she said quietly, the only person our daughter needs protection from is you. She ended the call before he could respond, then immediately turned off the phone and handed it to Cole. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady when she spoke. He's going to try to have me declared mentally incompetent, isn't he? He's going to claim I'm an unfit mother and try to take the baby. Miranda's voice came through the speaker, grim but determined. Probably Bartolante, but Victoria, we're not going to let that happen. But at 2:37 that afternoon, the first catastrophic event struck without warning. Victoria went into early labor, jolted awake from a nap by contractions that felt different from the practice contractions she had been experiencing for weeks. Emma, monitoring from the next room, heard her cry out and appeared immediately. How far apart? Emma asked, timing the contractions while Cole called Dr. Williams's emergency line. Every 3 minutes, Victoria gasped, her hand protectively covering her belly. But it's too early. She's not due for another 6 weeks. The drive to the hospital was a blur of pain and fear, with Cole navigating traffic while Emma provided steady reassurance from the back seat. The emergency room staff moved quickly, recognizing the signs of premature labor complicated by what Dr. Williams would later document as extreme maternal distress consistent with domestic violence trauma. "We need to stop these contractions," Dr. Williams explained as they prepared to administer medications. "The baby's lungs aren't fully developed yet, and every day she stays inside is crucial." Victoria nodded through another contraction, focusing on the medical equipment surrounding her bed rather than the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. This was exactly what Bradley had predicted would happen, that her decision to leave would endanger the baby, that her actions would prove she was an unfit mother. "This is my fault," she whispered to Emma, who was holding her hand during the medical procedures. "If I hadn't left, if I hadn't caused all this stress—" "Stop right there," Dr. Williams interrupted firmly. "Victoria, I've been your doctor for 6 months, and I've been documenting concerning signs throughout your pregnancy. Elevated blood pressure, chronic stress indicators, unexplained bruising, weight loss despite being pregnant. This labor isn't caused by leaving an abusive situation. It's caused by the chronic stress of living in one." The words hit Victoria with unexpected force. Dr. Williams had been seeing the signs of abuse all along and had been carefully documenting them in her medical records. The early labor wasn't evidence of Victoria's failure as a mother. It was evidence of the systematic damage that Bradley's abuse had inflicted on both her and their unborn child. But the worst was yet to come. Cole sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair next to Victoria's bed, his military training automatically cataloging security concerns and potential threats. The hospital staff had been briefed about the domestic violence situation and had placed Victoria in a room with restricted access. But Cole knew that Bradley's wealth and influence could overcome many institutional safeguards. His concerns proved justified when Bradley arrived at the hospital barely an hour after they had been admitted, accompanied by 2 men in expensive suits who carried themselves with the confident arrogance of lawyers accustomed to getting their way through intimidation and legal threats. "Where is my wife?" Bradley demanded at the nurse's station, his voice carrying the kind of authority that usually made people comply immediately. "I'm Bradley Pierce, and my wife Victoria is in premature labor. I demand to see her immediately." The head nurse, a veteran of 30 years who dealt with every kind of family crisis imaginable, looked at Bradley with professional politeness that carried no warmth whatsoever. "Sir, your wife is in a secure unit receiving medical care. She's conscious and able to make her own decisions about visitors. She's 7 months pregnant and in labor," one of Bradley's lawyers interjected. "She's not in a condition to make rational decisions. Her husband has legal rights as next of kin and father of the child." Cole appeared in the hallway at that moment, and the temperature in the corridor seemed to drop several degrees as the 2 men faced each other across the sterile institutional space. "Colonel Hayes," Bradley said with forced civility, "I'm glad you're here. Perhaps you can explain to the hospital staff that my wife needs her husband during this medical crisis." "Your wife," Cole replied quietly, "has made it very clear that she doesn't want to see you. The hospital staff is simply respecting her wishes." Bradley's facade of control cracked slightly, revealing the rage underneath. "She's in premature labor because of the stress you've caused her. Your interference in our marriage has endangered my child." Dr. Williams emerged from Victoria's room at that moment, her expression professionally cool but loaded with disapproval. At 51, she had delivered thousands of babies and had learned to recognize the signs of domestic violence with disturbing frequency. "Mr. Pierce," she said formally, "your wife is stable and we've successfully stopped the premature labor for now. However, she needs complete bed rest and minimal stress to prevent future episodes." "Then you understand why she needs to come home where I can properly care for her," Bradley said, his voice taking on the persuasive tone that had built his business empire. "Actually," Dr. Williams replied with quiet authority, "what I understand is that your wife's medical condition has dramatically improved since she left your home. Her blood pressure is lower than it's been in months, her stress indicators are normalized, and she's finally getting proper nutrition and sleep." The words hit Bradley like a slap, and Cole could see him struggling to maintain his carefully constructed image in front of the hospital staff and his legal team. "I want to see her," Bradley said, abandoning persuasion for direct demand. "I have rights as her husband and the father of this child." "You have the right to request a visit," Dr. Williams corrected. "She has the right to refuse. And given the documented history of domestic violence and the current restraining order, the hospital's policy is to defer to the patient's wishes." After Bradley and his legal team left, Cole returned to Victoria's room to find her connected to monitoring equipment that tracked both her vital signs and the baby's heartbeat. The steady electronic sounds were reassuring, but Victoria's expression was filled with guilt and fear. "He's right, isn't he?" she said quietly. "This happened because I left him. The stress of all this fighting caused an early labor." Dr. Williams pulled up a chair next to Victoria's bed, her expression serious but kind. "Victoria, I'm going to tell you something that I probably should have said months ago. Your pregnancy has been medically complicated from the beginning due to chronic stress, malnutrition, and what I now recognize as classic signs of domestic abuse." Victoria stared at her doctor in shock. "You knew." "I suspected," Dr. Williams admitted. "The weight loss during pregnancy, the elevated blood pressure, the way you flinched when I examined areas where you had bruising. But suspecting abuse and proving it are two different things." The relief that flooded through Victoria was overwhelming, and she finally had allowed herself to cry, not from fear or guilt, but from the release of 2 years of believing that everything was her fault. But the second catastrophic event was already in motion. Emma appeared in the doorway with coffee and updates that would shatter Victoria's brief moment of relief. Bradley's team just filed emergency custody motions claiming Victoria is mentally unstable, and the military family is holding her against her will. Court hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning. Victoria read the legal documents Emma handed her, feeling the familiar fear beginning to rise in her chest. But this time, instead of the isolated terror that had characterized the past 2 years, she was surrounded by people who understood that this was exactly the kind of legal warfare that abusers use to maintain control. "Tomorrow morning," she said quietly, looking around at Cole's determined expression, Emma's professional competence, and Dr. Williams's medical authority. "He's really going to try to have me declared incompetent, and we're really going to stop him," Cole replied with quiet certainty. But none of them were prepared for the third and most devastating catastrophe that would unfold before the court hearing could even take place. At 11:43 that evening, while Victoria slept under sedation and Cole maintained watch in the hospital corridor, Emma received a phone call that would change everything. Elena Pierce, Bradley's 61-year-old mother who had secretly contacted Victoria offering to help and testify about her son's learned abusive behavior, was found dead in her downtown apartment. The initial police report suggested suicide, but the timing was too convenient, and the circumstances too suspicious. Elena had been scheduled to provide testimony the next morning about Bradley's childhood behavior, his father's abusive methods, and the generational pattern of control and violence in the Pierce family. Her testimony would have been devastating to Bradley's carefully constructed image and his claims about Victoria's mental instability. With Elena's death, the evidence of Bradley's pattern of abuse spanning decades was gone. The independent witness who could have corroborated Victoria's accounts of systematic control and psychological manipulation was silenced forever. And Bradley's lawyers were already preparing to use his mother's apparent suicide as evidence of the family's history of mental instability, a genetic predisposition that Victoria's pregnancy hormones and her brother's military influence had triggered into dangerous territory. The triple catastrophe was complete. Victoria's premature labor provided evidence of her supposed instability under stress. The emergency custody motions positioned Bradley as the protective father trying to save his child from a dangerous situation. And Elena's death eliminated the most credible witness while providing ammunition for claims about hereditary mental illness. When Cole had to wake Victoria at dawn to tell her about Elena's death and explain how it would affect the custody hearing in 6 hours, he watched his sister's face crumble with the devastating realization that all their careful planning and evidence gathering had been systematically destroyed in less than 24 hours. Bradley Pierce had demonstrated that his wealth and influence could overcome any obstacle, silence any witness, and manipulate any situation to his advantage. For the first time since the confrontation at the diner, Victoria truly understood what she was fighting against and how little chance she had of winning. Victoria sat in the courthouse hallway 6 hours later, feeling completely broken. The emergency custody hearing had gone exactly as Bradley's expensive lawyers had orchestrated. Elena's death had eliminated their most powerful witness, while the premature labor provided supposed evidence of Victoria's inability to handle stress in her current situation. Judge Patricia Williamson had listened to both sides with the kind of professional detachment that came from 15 years of family court experience. But the evidence now favored Bradley's narrative. A successful CEO trying to protect his child from an unstable wife influenced by a military brother with documented PTSD. The temporary custody arrangement will be modified, Judge Williamson had announced. Given the medical complications, the witness irregularities, and the documented stress factors, the court finds that the child's welfare is best served by returning Mrs. Pierce to the marital home under her husband's care and medical supervision. Victoria collapsed as Bradley's lawyers explained the court order. She would return home immediately. Cole was prohibited from contact pending a full psychological evaluation. Any violation would result in immediate arrest and permanent loss of parental rights. Cole had been escorted from the courthouse by security, legally powerless to protect his sister from the man who had systematically destroyed every avenue of escape they had tried to build. Victoria found herself back in the mansion that had been her prison for 2 years. But now it was worse. Bradley's house had been modified during her absence with additional security cameras, locked cabinets for her medications, and monitoring devices that tracked her every movement and conversation. "You see what happens when you try to fight me," Bradley said quietly as he showed her through the enhanced security measures. "You see what I'm capable of when you threaten what's mine. My mother's death is on your hands, Victoria. Your instability, your paranoid accusations, your influence on my family, it killed her." Victoria sat in the nursery that Bradley had perfectly decorated for their daughter, feeling the baby move inside her and knowing that she had failed to protect either of them. Cole was under legal restraint. Emma was prohibited from contact. Grace's diner recordings had been ruled inadmissible due to technical challenges from Bradley's legal team. She was more isolated now than she had ever been, with the added knowledge that any attempt to escape would be met with the full force of Bradley's wealth and willingness to destroy anyone who helped her. For 3 days, Victoria lived in this enhanced prison, monitored constantly and reminded hourly that her daughter would grow up knowing that her mother had been too weak and unstable to provide a safe home. But on the 4th day, everything changed. Grace Murphy appeared at the mansion's front door, accompanied by a woman Victoria didn't recognize, and carrying a briefcase that suggested official business. "Mrs. Pierce," Grace said when Bradley answered the door, "I'm here with Agent Sarah Mitchell from the FBI Financial Crimes Division. We need to speak with your wife about some irregularities in your business practices that came to light during our investigation into Elena Pierce's death." Bradley's face went white as he realized that Elena's death had triggered exactly the kind of federal scrutiny that his business empire couldn't withstand. The private investigators he had hired to build a case against Victoria had inadvertently exposed his own financial crimes during their surveillance operations. Agent Mitchell's investigation had uncovered a pattern of financial manipulation, tax evasion, and corporate fraud spanning over a decade. Elena Pierce's death wasn't suicide. She had been murdered to prevent her from providing testimony not just about domestic violence, but about her knowledge of Bradley's business crimes. The evidence Elena had hidden in her safety deposit box wasn't just about family abuse patterns. It included banking records, corporate documents, and recorded conversations that documented Bradley's systematic financial crimes. "Mr. Pierce," Agent Mitchell said with the kind of quiet authority that made Bradley's corporate intimidation tactics look like childish tantrums, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, and violation of federal racketeering statutes." As FBI agents searched the mansion and arrested Bradley in front of his neighbors and business associates, Victoria sat in the nursery holding her belly and watching the careful facade of his perfect life crumble in real time. Cole appeared at the nursery door 20 minutes later, his legal restraints dissolved by the federal investigation that proved Victoria's abuse allegations had been not just true, but actually understated compared to the full scope of Bradley's criminal behavior. "Is it really over?" Victoria asked quietly as Cole helped her to her feet. "It's really over," Cole said, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from watching justice finally triumph over wealth and influence. Bradley's going to federal prison for a very long time. You and Hope are going to be safe. Victoria looked around the nursery that Bradley had designed to imprison both her and their daughter, then walked out of the mansion for the last time, carrying only the knowledge that sometimes the truth really was more powerful than money. 6 months later, Victoria stood behind the counter of what was now called Murphy's Safe Harbor Cafe, officially reopened as a community resource center with funding from the State Domestic Violence Prevention Program. The morning rush had just ended, leaving the comfortable buzz of conversation from the weekly support group meeting in the back room. The transformation of the diner mirrored Victoria's own journey from victim to survivor to advocate. What had begun as Grace's simple intervention in a domestic violence situation had grown into a recognized community resource, with partnerships with local law enforcement, healthcare providers, and legal aid organizations. "Victoria, could you come back here for a minute?" called Jennifer Martinez, the newest member of their support group who had been attending meetings for 3 weeks. "I think I'm ready to take the next step." Victoria wiped her hands on her apron, one that read, "Safe Harbor Cafe, where everyone deserves safety," and headed toward the back room where 12 women of various ages sat around a large table that had been donated by a local furniture store owned by a domestic violence survivor. Jennifer was 26, 7 months pregnant, and had been attending meetings without saying much beyond her first name. Today she looked different, determined rather than defeated, angry rather than afraid. "I want to file a police report," Jennifer said quietly, her hands protective over her belly in a gesture Victoria recognized. "I want to get a restraining order. I want to leave him." The room filled with supportive murmurs from women who understood exactly what those words meant. Not just the practical steps of leaving an abuser, but the psychological courage required to believe that escape was possible. Victoria sat down next to Jennifer, her own daughter Hope sleeping peacefully in the carrier she wore during work hours. Little Hope Hayes, Victoria had legally changed their last names, was now 4 months old, and represented everything Victoria had fought for during those dark months of pregnancy and legal battles. "Tell us what you need and we'll help you get it," Victoria said gently. "That's what we're here for." The support group had grown from Grace's initial idea into a comprehensive program that included safety planning, legal referrals, financial counseling, job training, and child care services. Victoria coordinated the program, while Emma provided professional counseling and Cole handled security concerns with tactical planning that kept everyone safe. After the support group ended, Victoria walked through the kitchen area where Cole was training a new volunteer cook, a former military medic who had found purpose in providing both food and safety for domestic violence survivors. "How's Jennifer doing?" Cole asked, noting Victoria's thoughtful expression. "She's ready to leave," Victoria replied. "Full safety plan, legal protection, housing arrangement. She reminds me of myself 8 months ago, scared but determined." Cole nodded with understanding. He had watched Victoria transform from the frightened woman in the diner booth to the confident advocate who now helped other women find their own strength. The change had been gradual but profound, driven by the discovery that helping others heal was often the most effective way to complete one's own healing process. Emma appeared from the office area carrying the kind of paperwork that kept nonprofit organizations running effectively. The Safe Harbor Cafe had received several grants for expansion, including a major funding award that would allow them to provide transitional housing services directly. "Good news and complicated news," Emma announced. "The State Domestic Violence Coalition wants to use our program as a model for rural community interventions." "That's the good news." "And the complicated news?" Victoria asked. "They want you to testify at the state legislature about effective community-based prevention programs. It would mean publicity, recognition, and possibly some unwanted attention from people who prefer that domestic violence remain invisible." Victoria considered the opportunity while bouncing Hope gently in her carrier. Public testimony would mean putting herself forward as an expert on domestic violence, using her own story to advocate for policy changes that could help thousands of women across the state. "I'll do it," Victoria said quietly. "If sharing my story can help other women, then it's worth any risk." Grace emerged from the kitchen where she had been preparing for the afternoon shift, her expression carrying the kind of pride that came from watching something good grow from a moment of moral courage. "Victoria, honey," Grace said, "there's someone here to see you. Says she drove down from the state capitol after hearing about our program. The woman waiting in the main dining area was Catherine Walsh, Elena Pierce's sister, who had come to thank Victoria for what her courage had ultimately accomplished. Elena's death had not been in vain. It had exposed Bradley's crimes and led to convictions that would keep him in federal prison for the rest of his life. "I wanted you to know," Catherine said, "that Elena's evidence helped convict not just Bradley, but 3 other men who were part of his business network. Your decision to fight back saved more lives than just your own." Victoria looked around the cafe at the space that had been transformed from a simple diner into a beacon of hope for women who had lost their way in abusive relationships. The booth where Bradley had grabbed her wrist was still there, but now it was surrounded by resource posters, community announcements, and photos of success stories from women who had found safety and rebuilt their lives. Cole was in the kitchen working alongside volunteers who had found purpose in providing both food and sanctuary. Emma was facilitating counseling sessions with women at different stages of leaving abusive relationships. Grace was coordinating with local law enforcement about safety protocols for high-risk clients. Victoria stood in the center of it all, holding her daughter who would grow up understanding that love meant support rather than control. That strength was measured by how you protected others rather than how you dominated them. That family was defined by who showed up when you needed them most. Her phone buzzed with a text from the legislature coordinator confirming her testimony date. "You're going to change lives up there, Victoria. You already have down here." Victoria looked at the message and felt the same sense of rightness that had guided her decisions since that afternoon when Cole had stepped between her and Bradley's anger. Some battles were worth fighting, some truths were worth telling, and some changes were worth the risk and effort required to make them happen. "Some people think family is about blood," Victoria said quietly to Hope, who was now awake and looking around the busy cafe with curious eyes. "But I learned it's about who shows up when you need them most." Outside, the parking lot was filled with cars belonging to women who had found their way to Murphy's Safe Harbor Cafe through word of mouth, referrals from healthcare providers, recommendations from law enforcement, or simply by recognizing the signs that had once described their own lives. Inside, Grace was already planning the next day's community meal. Cole was scheduling security training for other business owners who wanted to learn how to recognize and respond to domestic violence. And Emma was coordinating with the state coalition about expanding their program model to other rural communities. Victoria Hayes had come full circle, from victim to survivor to advocate, from isolation to community, from fear to hope. Her daughter would grow up in a world where women like her mother had fought to ensure that domestic violence was no longer a private shame, but a public responsibility. Where businesses like Safe Harbor Cafe provided not just food, but sanctuary. Where families were defined not by legal documents, but by who stood up when someone needed protection. The transformation was complete, but the work continued. Every day brought new women who needed to hear that escape was possible, that healing was achievable, that life after abuse could be not just survivable, but fulfilling. And every day soon. Victoria found new strength in the recognition that her own survival had meaning beyond her personal freedom. It had become a beacon for others still lost in the darkness of controlling relationships. Proof that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons or money, but with courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserved to live free from fear. As she locked up the cafe that night, Victoria paused to read the small plaque that had been installed next to the front door. Murphy's Safe Harbor Cafe, established in memory of all the women who didn't make it out, and in celebration of all the women who did. Her daughter slept peacefully in her car seat, surrounded by the security of a community that understood that protecting children meant protecting their mothers, that preventing domestic violence required everyone to get involved, and that sometimes the most important victories were won not in courtrooms or boardrooms, but in small diners where ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things. The story that had begun with Bradley's hand wrapped around her wrist in a diner booth had ended with her hand extended to other women who needed to know that escape was possible, that healing was achievable, and that the future could be different from the past. Some people thought family was about blood, but Victoria had learned it was about who showed up when you needed them most. And when her daughter grew up, she would understand that her mother had been surrounded by family in all the ways that truly mattered,